Well, greetings. We're going to be studying Immanuel Kant, and I will begin by talking about Kant's conception of truth. Why? This is not a general course on philosophy or a course on epistemology or theory of knowledge. Well, it's because Kant considers moral precepts to be truths of a particular kind, and he does exactly what he ought to do. He tells us what he means by calling them truths and how we can establish the sense in which they are true. Okay, not here talking about a reasonable opinion or best option, but he believes about rational truths. We will then look at his two major principles, the categorical imperative and the kingdom of ends, and explore what exactly they mean, why he holds those to be, if you will. I think the best way to look at it is they are each a test to determine if some proposed moral precept actually is a truth. Okay? We'll talk about some criticisms of Kant, some objections to particular aspects of Kant's approach, and we'll also talk about some of the impact of Kantian ethics. Okay? Kant's ethics have a great deal of impact on the areas that we have come to call universal human rights. Okay? That will be certainly worth exploring, and certainly a connection with the material we just studied when we looked at Socrates and Martin Luther King. Okay, I do want to point out, if you are using the Sturba book, the chapter on Kant, you only need to read it through page 71, the heading Supporting Examples. You can stop there. Now, we will return to that particular material when we're looking at Peter Singer's book later, but right now it's sort of a side issue that we don't want to get into, although it is important, and we will look at it later, as I say. If you are reading the Summers book instead, because you couldn't find a copy of the Serva book available, then just read the entire chapter on Kant. Alrighty, moral truths are truths. Now, begin with Kant wrote three critiques that are, if you will, the flagships of his philosophy: the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. Critique of pure reason attempts to find the most fundamental first principles necessary to have rational knowledge of the world, knowledge through science, mathematics, through reason, okay, through logic. Now he sees moral engagement to the world to be a unique, generically different way of engaging the world and requiring a different set of first principles. These he sets forward in his critique of practical reason. Okay. Critique of judgment is about his aesthetic principles. I'm not gonna really talk about that. I would not be the first person to say that it's probably the weakest of the three critiques, largely because Kant seems to not do what he needs to do or what he thinks he's doing, which is to find fundamental principles that aren't simply a matter of his own personal taste. Okay, we won't delve deeply into that, but that is, I'll just note that and move on. Okay, what we're looking at is particularly what he would be talking about in the critique of practical reason, or his shorter work, sort of a condensed version of that, called Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Morals. Alrighty, Kant divides up truth into these categories, which are on your study guide. I just printed this out so that I can show you what to be looking at. And of course, it's backwards, I think. A priori and a posteriori. A priori means that it's known prior to experience. It's logically or conceptually prior to experience. Not that it's known prior in terms of time or cause and effect. Think of, in mathematics, axioms and corollaries. A priori knowledge would be the axioms, okay? The first principles. All reasoning proceeds from first principles. A posteriori means that it's known only after experience. Without experience of the world, you can't possibly know the truth or falsity of an a posteriori statement. Okay, so truths may be true a priori, they may be true a posteriori. Okay, synthetic means you're putting things together, and analytic means you're taking things apart. Okay, so you end up with analytic a priori, synthetic a priori, analytic a posteriori, and analytic a posteriori and analytic a priori. Okay, so if we're talking about things being true analytic a priori, and a typical example would be things that are true by definition. For instance, a statement, and the examples I think make this much more clear. The examples include statements such as bachelor equals unmarried male. Okay, you don't have to go talk to or look at or experiment on or whatever real living people in order to know that bachelor means unmarried male. All you have to do is be able to take apart the term. I mean, you can know what the term unicorn means by definition without having to encounter real unicorns. Okay. Analytic a posteriori. Kant thinks that this category doesn't actually exist, that there is no such thing. There's at least one philosopher, who was also a mathematician. I'm going to put this down because it's on your study guide. You know what to look for now. Patrick Suppes, who was for many years at Stanford University, is both a mathematician and a philosopher, and he claims that certain areas of descriptive mathematics satisfy the description analytic a posteriori. Kant didn't think anything would fall into that category, but c'est la vie, okay? Or c'est la guerre, there's the war, okay? Synthetic a priori, I'm going to hold off and return to that in a moment. Synthetic a posteriori, that would be things that you know only after experience, and you can't possibly, no matter how long you stare at the definitions, know if the statement is true or false. Now, I gave the example, well, they are contingent truths. That is, they may be true on one occasion or one circumstance. They may be false in other circumstances or at another time. Okay, if I say the current president of the United States once had a reality show on television, that at the time I'm making this video, that is true. But if I had said that 10 years ago, it would be false. Okay, if I say that 10 years from now, presumably it will be false unless we end up electing another reality show star. Contingent truths means that it depends. Okay, it's not always true, it's not always false. And that's why it's synthetic a posteriori. We actually have to look at the world and figure things out. If I were to say the average height of a bachelor in the Greater Hartford area is 5'5", there's no way I could tell whether that's true or false just by analyzing the terms. I would have to actually go out and take measurements and gather data and do the calculations in order to figure out if that were in fact true. It's contingent, and it might, if true on one occasion, a year later it might not be true. A year before that it might not have been true. Okay. Synthetic a priori. That's important to us because that's what Kant thinks moral precepts, legitimate moral precepts are. They are synthetic a priori truths. Now, what does that mean? A priori means that they are first principles. They are the axioms upon which other knowledge depends. Synthetic means that we have to actually have some experience of the world in order to discover them, in order to realize them. We're not inventing them, we're discovering them. We're discovering they're already operative in the world. Plato, when he talks about geometry, basically talks about it in a similar fashion. People who study geometry, they look at a number of particular triangles, they figure out what they have in common, they are able to say, okay, here is the definition of a triangle. I didn't just concoct that. It's look, here are the things that are triangular, and here's what they have in common. Okay. Now I think it's important. I think it's important to understand this notion of synthetic a priori for this reason. First of all, if it's a first principle, is it just all up for grabs? I think no. Okay, that's what I think certain, particularly continental philosophers in the 20th century, made that mistake of saying, well, if I can take apart your view and show the principles it's based on and show that people could, in fact, embrace other principles instead, then I've shown that, there's absolutely no reason to embrace yours. That's not necessarily true. We do, in fact, adjudicate between competing axioms, competing first principles, by asking what consequences are there if I adopt these, what consequences are there if I reject them, what consequences are there if I embrace a different set of principles, and so forth. Now, in logic, we do that. Certainly in morals or ethics, very likely we're going to do something very similar. Well, if we embrace these principles, what are the consequences going to be? Well, what about if we embrace these other principles? What are the consequences going to be? Okay, something that is oftentimes used as an example of a synthetic a priori truth is what in traditional logic is called the principle of identity. And I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I just want to give you an idea of what kind of thing Kant's talking about. We talk about the notion of necessary truth and whether it's viable and so forth in my intro philosophy class, but we need to only look at a limited amount of stuff here in that regard. Okay. The principle of identity is that anything is identical to itself. Okay? Nothing can, as Aristotle puts it, nothing can be simultaneously true and false in the same sense. Okay? Contradictories are not contraries. A hot fudge sundae can have parts that are hot and parts that are cold. Okay? That's not a contradiction. I knew an art teacher who used to say, well, I don't think there's anything to philosophy because, for one thing, you proceed as if contradictions must be false, but contradictions can be true. For instance, I love my wife and I hate my wife. And of course, most people responded by time out, too much information, But I would wager that what he meant was there are some things about my wife that I love and some things about her that I hate, or at some times I love her and at other times I hate her. Well, contraries can coexist, but that's not the same as a contradiction. The same thing can't both be and not be at the same time. Contradictions are necessarily false. Okay? That's oftentimes looked upon as being absolutely the foundation of logic in the Western world, certainly, and crucial to the way philosophy has proceeded in the Western world, whether it's moral philosophy or some other topic within philosophy. What Kant thinks is that he can provide a test that will allow us to determine whether proposed moral precepts are true a priori, whether they are synthetic a priori truths or whether they fail that test, whether they are necessary truths or whether they fail that test. Exactly, but this way, that he will show that you can't deny them without contradicting yourself. You can't embrace their opposite without destroying the whole enterprise you're engaged in. Okay, we'll try to evaluate later whether to what extent the test works and just how good of a test it is. But okay, you with me so far? Socrates says that all real knowledge is recollection. What the Greek term that's translated as recollection is anamnesis, which literally means not forgetting. Okay, It'd be interesting to translate instead of recollecting to translate that as being mindful. Okay, in other words, think of it this way. You work with computers, right? Most of the time you're using the front end of the software. You never have to think about the source code. The source code is always running in the background. Without the source code, that front end doesn't work. Okay, so if there are problems, if there are contradictions, if you will, in the source code, you're going to have problems with the rest of the program. And give an example of the kind of demonstration that would be given of the principle of identity being a necessary truth. Okay, here's a pen. If I suspend the principle of identity, the notion that anything is identical to itself and contradictions are necessarily false, can I talk about this pen? Of course. And of course not. And both yes and no. And neither yes nor no. And all of the above. And none of the above, because this pen is the pen, but it's also not the pen. At the same time and in the same sense. And it's both the pen and not the pen. All of that is true, and none of that is true. All of the above, none of the above. Okay. And what I say about it is what I say about it, but it's not what I say about it. And it is, but it isn't. You see what happens, and that should not have made any sense to you. Don't panic and say, what is he talking about? It's just an illustration. Yeah, we can't allow contradictions to be true at least at the level of everyday conversation, without turning our attempts to talk about the world into mush. Okay? So, if we can prove that certain moral axioms are necessary truths in that same sense, that we are simply learning the source code, or we are simply, in Socratic terms, recollecting what principles are operating at a deep level, allowing us to live in the world, then we've given awfully good proof of our moral precepts. Okay? So, Kant is, if we give an appropriate amount of time to understanding what Kant means by calling things moral truths, which we just did, Kant is probably the most difficult material that you'll deal with this semester in this course. I had a written comment from a student one semester years ago who said, I'm a senior majoring in philosophy, and McKinster's explanation of Kant is probably the clearest and most helpful that I've ever heard. Now, I'm not saying that to pat myself on the back. I'm saying that to say, take heart. Okay, you can do this. When I was taking Sanskrit, our Sanskrit professor said once in the early weeks of the semester, Sanskrit is a very difficult language, very complex and subtle. In fact, learning Sanskrit is so difficult, it's impossible to do unless you are either a computer or a 4-year-old Indian child. So, okay, we're appropriately chastised. We'll just, work harder. All right, so moving ahead, what principles does Kant think pass the test for being necessary truths? Okay. Well, the test will turn out to be a pair of principles, the categorical imperative and the kingdom of ends. Okay. Sturba also talks about the hypothetical imperative, but we're not going to even get into that because it's just less important for what we're doing at this moment. Okay. The categorical imperative. Categorical means without exception. Imperative means it's a command. Okay. In your study guide, I've parsed out the form of it. He has several different ways of formulating it. I've parsed out the form I like best because it's the most inclusive of all the nuances he means. I'm breaking it out for you right now. Act as if, by your act, the maxim of your act would pass from being a law of freedom to a law of nature. Okay, let's take that piece by piece. Since you don't necessarily have to be looking at my face or my conure while you're hearing this, you might want to be actually looking at your study guide while we're talking about this. Is that right? Yeah, okay. Okay, act as if. Okay, as if. This is not a cause-effect consideration, but a matter of principle. It's like the principle of rational reflection in the Credo. If I'm going to do something that is of moral significance, I should be doing it based on principle. Okay, based on principle, not simply based on seat of the pants, or simply based on feeling or whatever else. I should know what my principles are, be able to clearly articulate them, and be able to reason out if these are the principles I embrace, then consequentially, this is the conclusion I must arrive at. Okay, so act as if the maxim of your act would, because you did it, pass from being a law of freedom to a law of nature. Okay. Alrighty, law of freedom. Law of freedom is what we ought to do, but not what we have to do. We have the freedom to choose. If you remember, I discussed Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the notion of freedom, and we talked about the Euthyphro, the last comments on the Euthyphro problem. We are free to choose, or condemned to freedom, as Sartre puts it. It means, you are responsible for the choices you make. So, we may choose to do it or not to do it. Well, most moral decisions are like that. Even if clearly A is what I should do, I may decide to do B instead for any number of reasons. Sentimental reasons, or reasons about self-gain, or fear, or whatever. I may choose to not do the right thing, even if I believe that it's the right thing. Okay? The right thing morally. Because consideration of what is moral is only one of the possible motives a human being might have in real world situations. Law of nature we have no choice about. Okay? Falling objects fall at a rate of 32 feet per second, not correcting for various atmospheric interference. Okay? The pen didn't choose to fall at that rate. That's a law of nature. That's a regularity in nature. You take my intro course to find out a little more about what we mean and don't mean by calling regularities in nature laws. So gee, okay, act as if by choosing to act on this particular principle, it would no longer be a matter of so that we had to choose and could hence choose to disobey. It would become a matter of human nature, something that we just naturally did, as naturally as this pen fell at the appropriate rate. Okay? Now, supposing the principle was, act out of kindness. Do the most benevolent thing that you can do in the situation. The most good, the least harm. You might say, if that's my motivation, I might say, yeah, that maxim is something I could wish to universalize. And actually, if I could wave a magic wand and change human nature so that everybody automatically did that, that would be a good thing. We'd all be better off. I would be better off. You would be better off. Collectively, we'd be better off. What if, again, reference back to the Credo, what if my choice was, you know what? My moral principles are important to me, but good grief, I've got so much to lose here. I'll forget my moral principles when my self-interest is at stake. Well, could I wish to universalize that? That everybody simply sacrifice their moral principles if their self-interest is at stake? You remember, this is exactly why Socrates rejects the jailbreak in the end. I would be the corrupter of youth and the destroyer of the city if I chose to do this. Why? Well, it's not a cause. Again, it's not cause-effect. It's a matter of principle. He's saying if I can't universalize the principle I would be deciding on, because the principle would have to be something like forget your moral duty if your personal self-interest is at stake. But if I taught by example that we should do that, it would be the corrupter of youth. And if indeed that were universalized, then that would be the destroyer of cities. Okay, so there are things that I would like to see human beings do because they promote, as Kant put it, promote civil society, and it is create a moral order in which we can all live and we can all flourish. There's a lovely term, flourish. It means not just that we're surviving, but actually that we're doing well. Not merely that we're living, but we're having a good life. Okay? Flourishing, the Greek term is eudaimonia. It's sometimes translated as happiness, although most people who translate it as happiness will immediately tell you that's not really the best translation, but there's no simple English term for that. One of my own philosophy professors used to like to translate that as flourishing. And in the realm of environmental ethics, that's a term that's often used. Flourishing means that you actually have the circumstances, you're able to create the circumstances under which you can live well, and you have the personal disposition to be able to take full advantage of those circumstances. Okay, so moral order is what allows us to flourish in human society. Okay, and that is a good segue into the second test, kingdom of ends. Kingdom of ends, to put it simply, is never treat a person merely as a means, but always also as an end. Okay. Now, Kant says a moral agent, but he does think that there aren't any moral agents except for human beings, and we're going to actually take a look at whether that is a believable proposition or not. Basically, there are many thinkers who would say today, the more we learn about animal neurology and the more we learn about, we are animals, the more we learn about non-human neurology and non-human cognition, the more reason we have to believe that what we call morals or moral relationships or morally significant sentiments within the human community are not without parallel among many animals. So, okay, never treat a person merely as a means, but always also as an end. Remember we talked about expediting the good? Some things we value as a means, some things we value as an end. Okay, to expedite the good, you want to use the most efficient possible means to achieve the best possible end, and to do it with the least collateral damage. So, never treat a person merely as a means, but always also as an end. Now, I hear many fairly, let's say, overly simplistic criticisms of Kant based on this idea. Sometimes from people who should know better. Well, it's impossible to live without treating other people as a means. For instance, there's nothing immoral about my using, the waitstaff in a restaurant as a means of getting my meal. There's nothing immoral about using the doctor as a means of, curing my illness. Okay, but Kant didn't say that there was anything immoral about that. He said you must never use another human being merely as a means. The important principle is that every human being has intrinsic moral value. Every moral agent has intrinsic moral value. Okay? And because of that, they have to be treated as if they are valuable in themselves, not merely used as an object. Do you remember we talked about the difference between the I-thou and the I-it relationship? You can't just have an I-it relationship with everyone. Okay? Example that's often given, waitstaff. This might mean more to you if you've ever worked as waitstaff, if you've ever worked in customer service, if you've ever worked as a retail clerk. There are people who will be abusive and nasty just because they figure they can get away with it. You can't say anything about it. I'll threaten to take my business elsewhere, or I'll complain to the manager. I've actually seen abusive customers get thrown out of at least one restaurant. Said, I'm going to take my business elsewhere. You do that. I'd rather have one good waitress than one abusive, disruptive customer. And in the end, you do foster customer loyalty as well as staff loyalty by having that attitude. So it is perfectly okay, for instance, if I have a factory, to treat my workers as a means of producing our goods. But I must also treat them recognizing that they are human beings. I must give due thought to their safety, to their well-being, pay them a living wage, if possible, provide them with health benefits. It is okay for me to be in a relationship, say, in which the significant other, for me it would be my wife, is a means to an end. Provide my happiness, provide for my happiness, appreciate my sense of humor, and respond with a very similar sense of humor on her own, and so forth and so forth. Have long, meaningful talks deep into the night. Yeah, I mean, this is a means of providing things to me that are good, but would also value her as an end in herself, deserving of respect, deserving to be honored, deserving to have her own aspirations, her own feelings, her own value validated. It's that word merely that catches what's important here. It's wrong to ever treat another person merely as a means. You must also always treat them as an end. Okay, and that, I think, some people say that's a corollary to the categorical imperative, but I don't think it's necessarily a corollary so much as it is an additional perspective on how it is that moral truths provide a moral order in which human beings can flourish. Okay? Now, Kant gives us 4 examples of practices that would not pass muster for the categorical imperative. And he uses this as a way of illustrating what it is the categorical imperative is supposed to do. It's supposed to eliminate practices that would not pass this test, that would not be universalizable as conducive to the moral order. So, I will, on Kant's behalf, say that he seems almost offhand with these examples, as if he just really is a little bit bored with, that's my take on it, a little bit bored with having to give us examples at all. Kant is working at a theoretical basis, a deep theoretical basis, and I don't think he's terribly interested in giving us examples. But he does give us examples. And I think that many critics who attack these examples are maybe taking them too absolutely, okay? Are saying, well, this shows how out of touch Kant is with the real, honest-to-goodness, flesh and blood moral life. Now, I don't think that that's entirely unfair, but I also don't think it's an entirely adequate attempt to refute the categorical imperative. But let's take a look at those 4 examples and ask if there are exceptions. Okay. First of all, insincere promising. We must never make an insincere promise. Why? Could we universalize the practice of making an insincere promise? If we did, everyone would make insincere promises. They would do so casually. If it were universalized, particularly if it passed from being a law of freedom to being a law of nature. If promises were routinely insincere, nobody would believe promises anymore. And if nobody believed promises anymore, people would stop making promises because why bother? Nobody's going to believe it anyway. So Kant says, you see, saying that it's okay to make insincere promises for any reason is essentially to destroy the institution of promising itself. An institution of promising is an important part of, if you will, the moral order of civil society. If our promises are routinely insincere, that would be a destroyer of cities, a destroyer of the law, and the corrupter of the youth. Now, some would say Kant is just going way too far with this. Even Socrates in Book 1 of the Republic, as I mentioned before, and we were talking about the dialogues, Socrates gives the example of, what if I borrow a weapon from a neighbor and I sincerely promise I will return it on a particular day at a particular time. But in the interim, the neighbor goes stark raving mad. What sensible person is going to say I'm doing the right thing by keeping that promise, repaying that debt, and returning the weapon to the madman, putting a weapon into the hands of a madman, or telling him the strict truth if he comes to my door? Okay. Socrates would say there are exceptions. Those exceptions always seem to be that what is a legitimate, commonplace moral rule, and usually helpful in very particular circumstances, may in fact be detrimental to the moral order and may be overridden by an even more fundamental moral rule. We'll talk about that later when we talk about something called situation ethics. Okay. Suicide. Kant says, into every life there falls some travail and some sorrow. If suicide were an appropriate response to the difficulties of life, then everyone would commit suicide. There would be no human race. No reasonable human being could want that to happen. Well, okay, first of all, my God, what an oversimplification. Kant lived his whole life in the same town. He didn't really travel. He didn't see that much of life. To say into every life there comes some trouble and some travail is to vastly trivialize the suffering of some people. Okay. Also, I mean, at this point, we would say, if a person is suicidal, it may not have to do with the troubles and travails of life. It may actually be a neurological disorder. It may actually be a hormonal upset. I mean, there are oftentimes neurological reasons for this. I don't know if you've ever suffered from or ever known anyone who has suffered from clinical depression. It's a neurological disorder. It has to be treated as a neurological order. You've probably seen memes on social media where people say, you don't need these pills for your depression. What you need is to put on tennis shoes, run around in the woods, and sing a happy tune. My God, and I don't know which is worse there, the stupidity or the lack of compassion. Now, if you're just in a bad mood, yeah, but depression's not a bad mood. I'll say, what? You have cancer? All you really need to do is to learn to whistle and play the kazoo. I don't think that's going to help. It might make you feel a little better in the meantime, but depression is a disease, and it's a tricky disease, and there are people who struggle to live a normal life. And it's not because they have a bad attitude. Okay? So in short, Kant just doesn't know what he's talking about here, I would say. You can say that, right? I mean, you can say that to even in a presidential debate. You can just say, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, Kant, as revered as he is as a thinker, I think doesn't really have a clue what he's talking about. And let's say you had no choice but to either live indefinitely in utter misery or to end your life now. There was a movie during the 1960s that was kind of a cult favorite called Harold and Maude, about a young man who has a relationship with a much older woman, and She's his mentor about, you know, looking at life more, more positively. But she's decided when she hits a certain age, she's going to end her life. Why? Because she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to end up helpless and miserable. All of her friends are dead, and so forth and so forth. No, I'd rather go when I'm when I'm robustly enjoying life, so that's my last experience of life. Well, it's difficult to say that's not a rational decision. And she's not saying everybody should go kill themselves. And she's not even killing herself because of troubles. She was killing herself because she values life, but she values the quality of life and in very particular ways. So, in Japan, traditional Japan, suicide was looked upon as very honorable. If I'm in a dilemma where I can either go this way and dishonor myself or go that way and dishonor myself, you know what? I won't go this way or that way. I will stay right where I am and end my life. Why? Because it's better to live with honor than with dishonor. If I'm dying now rather than dishonor myself, I have lived my whole life with honor, and that's a good way to go. You may not agree with that, but on the other hand, to say that that's irrational or cowardly or weak or something is and that would exhibit an incredibly shallow understanding. There was a controversy in the Catholic Church when the film The Exorcist was first out. Well, it actually provoked a number of controversies in the Catholic Church, but if you haven't seen it, I'm afraid here's a spoiler, okay? At the end, turns out the demon didn't want the little girl at all. The demon wanted the priest. The priest tricks the demon into leaving the little girl, entering into him, throws himself out the window, presumably to his death. You presume that until 2 sequels later. Ooh, another spoiler. But in doing that, he's first of all saved the little girl's life, and second, he's sacrificed his own life to save her, and he's denied this demon a vehicle through which to torment humanity. Okay? Seems heroic, right? Seems like noble self-sacrifice. There were people within the church who said, no, that priest is damned because he committed suicide, and suicide is a cardinal sin. So, well, was the crucifixion a cardinal sin? I mean, Jesus wrote, according to the biblical account, rode into Roman-occupied Jerusalem on a high holiday and proclaimed, I'm king of the Jews. You might as well have a blinking neon sign that says, crucify me to do that. Okay, was that a cardinal sin? Well, of course not. That's looked upon as self-sacrifice, and to give up your own life for the welfare of others is looked upon as very noble. Well, I'm thinking of all kinds of other examples. I have to stop myself now, or I'll just keep recounting things from both classic literature, popular literature, etc. At the end of, if you saw The Dark Knight Rises a number of years ago, philosophically very interesting film. The whole trilogy was very, very interesting from a philosophical standpoint. But at the end, the Batman is going to, it appears, sacrifice his own life to save the city of Gotham. Now, before you realize that, he had one more trick up his sleeve. Were you sitting there saying, what a coward. How irrational. What he's doing is immoral. You must never commit suicide, no matter what the goal. Okay, life's not that simple. Okay. The third example, letting one's talents go undeveloped. And you have kind of an idea what Kant is after here. All the goods that make it possible for us to flourish in human society exist because someone decided to develop their talents, to not allow their talents to go undeveloped. Okay? So if everybody decided, what the heck, yeah, I have this talent, but I'm too lazy to develop it, or I just don't care. I am not interested in what I can contribute to society. I'll just let it go fallow. Then we would have none of the goods that we have. clearly we couldn't want this to be universalized, because we would not only be the perpetrator of this attitude, we would also be the recipient of the consequences. The same with insincere promising. I wouldn't just be, if we universalize that, I wouldn't just be making insincere promises. I would be the victim of insincere promises. So I couldn't want to universalize it. Suicide. Well, I'm going to kill myself if I have good reason. Well, what about if the people, my loved ones, the people I depend on, were committing suicide for similar reasons? Yeah, you probably would have to allow them that choice, wouldn't you? But, okay, letting one's talents go undeveloped. The problem here is the incredible ambiguity and the difficulty, again, of applying it to real-life situations, which are complex. Supposing I am a really good guitarist. Okay, I'm not. I don't play the guitar at all. Supposing I am a really good guitarist. My father, who built the family business that has supported the whole family, suddenly dies unexpectedly of a heart attack, and running the family business falls to me. Now, I will not be able to pursue my dream of being a musician and also run the family business and continue to support all the people who work for the family business, including a lot of members of my own family. So I just say, you know what, I can't let my talents go undeveloped. You're all on your own. I'm going to go play the guitar. Okay. I'm sure where I live, the Valley, Northampton, Amherst area, we really have a lack of people who think they are talented guitar players. No, we have an abundance of people who are musicians and who believe themselves to be very good musicians, and some of them are. On that topic, someone of my acquaintance was a really fine musician. Many people considered him to be, I'm going to preserve his privacy by not giving you too many details, but he was considered by many to be one of the best musicians in the Pioneer Valley. Okay, where there are many, many different musicians, but he was considered one of the best by many people. I used to tell them, why don't you actually go to like New York or to LA or San Francisco at least, or even to Chicago and play the clubs. And what will happen is you will be playing with a higher grade of musicians you're currently playing with, and that'll be a growth experience for you. But I think he kind of realized he was a very big fish in a small fishbowl, and it was kind of comfortable to stay in a small fishbowl. Was that allowing his talents to go undeveloped? Well, he was playing his guitar, not guitar, actually he didn't play the guitar. He was playing his instrument, and he was getting better at it as the years went by, but he was not developing it as fully as he could have if he challenged himself more. Okay, now here's another twist to it. His mother became critically ill. She needed 24-hour care. He couldn't afford it. She couldn't afford it. He had siblings, but they couldn't afford it. So he went to live with her so he could take care of her 24/7. And none of the siblings helped out. He did it on his own. But that meant that as each year went by, he gave up more and more and more of his profession as a musician, his avocation as a musician. He turned down gigs. He turned down an opportunity to travel to, I believe it was Paris, and perform. He gave up all kinds of things and kind of disappeared from the music scene where he had been ubiquitous to take care of his mother. Now, would we look at this, letting one's talents go undeveloped, and say, you know what he did, giving up his music to take care of his mother, was absolutely immoral? Of course not. Life's not that simple. Jean-Paul Sartre, I mentioned Sartre again, right? Jean-Paul Sartre gave an important example. Supposing I'm a young man in France during World War II. Germany's occupied France. The resistance is fighting against the occupying Germans. But I am the sole support for my elderly mother. If I go to join the resistance and fight the Germans, there will be no one to take care of my mother. She might not make it through the winter. But if I stay here and just take care of my own small circle, if you will, I'm doing nothing to stop this horrendous evil that's killing many, many people. So what's the right choice? Sartre says there is no right choice. But we'll actually talk about that later. But there is no one obvious right choice. But yeah, in the one case, I'm saying I'm putting my personal relationships above any larger concerns. Is that always wrong? Now, many people might do that, and it's nothing but self-indulgence, or it's nothing but ego, or it's nothing but self-interest. But what if it isn't? What if basically I am honoring very primal relationships? You know, child and parent is a very basic relationship, a primal relationship, if you will. Confucius would have said it's actually those basic relationships. We talked about this when we talked about the expanding circle. It's those basic relationships that teach us the building blocks of what makes up moral order in our society. So, was my acquaintance doing wrong? Right? Most of us would be inclined to say no. Okay, finally, 4. A life without normal human affection and friendship. People who want to say that Kant is some sort of crypto-Nazi with blood, with ice water in his veins instead of blood, I always like to point to this. And Kant says no reasonable human being could possibly desire a life without normal human affection and friendship, because after all, look at the goods that arise from that. It's not just that it's a more pleasant life, but that it is a life that is the origin of many, many other important goods. Okay. Now, here we see one of the things that many of Kant's critics would say is one of the chief problems with Kant, and that is he doesn't think that sentiment should play any role in morality. Yeah, I should do the right thing because it's the right thing. Whether it's what I want to do, whether it's what I'm inclined to do, whether it's what I enjoy doing or like doing or feel like doing is another question. Because I may not feel like doing the right thing, I should do it anyway because it's the right thing. When we talked about the Credo the Euthyphro and Euthyphro's relationship to his father, the familial duties that a son might have toward his father. And I mentioned that the great short novel by Nikolai Gogol, the Russian writer, called Taurus Bulba. Taurus Bulba ends up in a situation where he has to shoot his own son, and he has to do it for the sake of his whole people, the whole Cossack tribe. They're all dependent on him. I can't say my son's life is more important than the lives of everyone else's son. I have to shoot him, although it breaks my heart to do it. I talked about the example in the Iliad. Zeus cried tears of blood, but stayed his hand. Why? Well, what's he talking about? There's a battle going on between the Greeks and the Trojans. Zeus sees one of his favorite heroes, that is, the son of a human mother and a god, is about to be struck down in battle, but Zeus had solemnly promised that he would not intervene in this battle. So Homer writes, though he cried tears of blood, he stayed his hand. Okay. Now you've doubtless met people, and this is what annoys Kant. One of the things that annoys Kant. I'll talk about other things later. One of the things that annoys Kant is that there are people who consider themselves very good people, and usually they're capable of acting kindly or generously on certain occasions. But when they feel like being selfish or malicious, they'll do that. Why? Because they are only just doing what they feel like doing. Kant says, if I treat you fairly, because it pleases me to do so, then I'll treat you unfairly when that pleases me. How I feel about it shouldn't matter at all. You are a human being. You are entitled to being treated fairly, regardless of whether I want to or not. Let's make this into sort of a really commonplace example. What if I have a student who I really like, great personality, funny, just it's a pleasure to have in class, but does very mediocre work. I have to give that student the appropriate grade, the grade that was earned. I can't say, oh yeah, but I really like this person. I'm going to just bump that grade up. Anybody who would do that should be fired. Yes, I said that. Anyone who would do that, who would assign a grade simply because you like a student, should be fired. And look at the flip side of that. What if I have a student who's doing perfectly fine work, but I find that student to be incredibly annoying? Should I drop that grade down? Revenge. If I did that, I should be fired. You should give the student the grade the student earns and nothing else. And there are even ethical codes for educators that say exactly that. You may never evaluate a student on the grounds of anything other than the actual quality of the student's work. Now, if I'm bumping your grade up or down because of your race, because of your gender, because of your religion, because of your political point of view, there's something seriously wrong with what I'm doing. Coffee, the nectar of life. A friend of mine who's a witch who always says, never mess with a witch, especially before she has a cup of coffee in the morning. I said, yeah, well, I'm not, and the same applies to me. All right. You deserve to be treated fairly just because you're a human being. Whether I like you or dislike you doesn't enter into it. Okay? And we'll talk more about that. We'll talk more about that later. But when we talk about what's called the open question argument. So I'll just note that now. And much later when we're talking about ethical relativism, I'll mention what's called the open question argument, G.E. Moore, the naturalistic fallacy, a number of other things that are related. Okay? I like to do this doesn't mean it's the right thing. I don't like to do it doesn't mean it's not the right thing. Okay? The problem with trying to exile sentiment entirely from our moral judgments is nailed, I think, by Plato. Boy, big surprise, right? And by David Hume. Plato talks about the self as being a chariot pulled by 3 horses. Those 3 horses are reason, appetite, and passion. Appetite is a strong horse. It gives a lot of energy to that chariot. But don't ever let appetite steer, because appetite has no judgment. It'll just go right for whatever it wants. Take that chariot right off the side of the road and into the lake. Same with passion. Passion, or if you will, spirit, or whatever, that is a great motivator. That is a great source of energy. But passion will just go right after the object of desire, without any view of, what damage am I going to do? I mean, that's basically how we get things like road rage, extremism in politics, okay? Teenage pregnancies. I should say unintentional teenage pregnancies. As people say, oh, just, my feelings were so strong. What could I do? You could actually engage your brain. As Alfred Adler, one of the early great psychoanalysts, said, follow your heart, but take your brain with you. Okay? So Passion, appetite, it's great to have those steeds pulling the chariot, but that third steed, reason, keep it harnessed out in front so it can steer. Motivated by appetite and passion, but let reason steer. Reason alone among those three horses can weigh consequences, can anticipate consequences, can weigh alternatives. That's why you let reason steer. Okay. Now Plato says, but reason by itself isn't strong enough to pull that chariot. Okay. David Hume, centuries later, says something very similar. He says, look, reason by itself cannot motivate humans in anything, certainly not in moral matters. Sentiment has to play a role. I have to not only see what the facts are, I have to care about something, or else I'm not going to do anything about the facts. Right? You tell somebody, look, this situation is unjust, and they say, yeah, I can see that, but you know what, I just don't care about it, so I'm not going to do anything. Okay, what's thwarting morality there is not lack of reason, it's lack of caring, lack of sentiment. Hearts and minds are both engaged in ethics. Okay? But you have to care enough to actually think things through. Follow your heart, but take your brain with you. Let reason steer. Okay. So can we exile sentiment entirely? Most philosophers would say no. If you try to exile sentiment entirely from human morality, basically we won't do a bloody thing. Okay. Now, where does that leave us? What are the takeaways from Kant? Well, I'm going to talk about how Kant, in the next lecture, about how Kant, let's say, put forward a number of principles that were very important for what was called the rights of man, a intellectual movement called the rights of man, a social movement too, called the rights of man, and today called universal human rights. It's basically the continuation of the rights of man. Man was, theoretically at least, used generically there. I'll just give you a teaser. Okay, in your study guide, you have a list that looks like this. Okay, you can look at that. According to Kant, moral truths are, first of all, a priori, that is necessary. Self-evident is another term that philosophers sometimes use. By self-evident, they don't mean obvious. What they mean is these are axioms. They don't have to be proven by something else. They're proved through their use. They are universal. They apply to all people equally. Intrinsic to our humanity, it is your moral worth, your moral significance as a human being arises from the fact that you're a person. They are categorical, that is, they are without exception. And Kant would continue, they are expressed in terms of reciprocal rights and duties. No one may be arbitrarily deprived of life. I have a right not to be arbitrarily deprived of life, but I also have a duty not to arbitrarily deprive others of their lives. No one may be arbitrarily deprived of autonomy. That's my right, but it's also my duty not to arbitrarily deprive others of their autonomy. No one may be arbitrarily deprived of self-actualization. It means I have a right to decide what I would consider to be a good life and then to pursue it. I don't have a right to a good life. I have a right to pursue a good life. Okay, and I don't have any right to arbitrarily deprive other people of self-actualization. Okay, Kant, late 18th century. Can you think of something else that was written in the late 18th century that takes this laundry list of principles, if you will, and turns it into a political doctrine that would shake the world, shake history? Okay. Moral truths are a priori, universal, intrinsic to our humanity, categorical, expressed in rights and duties. No one may be arbitrarily deprived of life. No one may be arbitrarily deprived of autonomy. No one may be arbitrarily deprived of self-actualization. Well, have you ever heard the words? Have you ever heard it put this way? We hold, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whoa. Sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Okay. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, which I just quoted, but it was edited by John Adams, who, by the way, was, he and Sam Adams were relatives. And Sam Adams was, as well as being a brewer, was also an important patriot. He founded the Sons of Liberty, who pulled off the Boston Tea Party. So John Adams, one of the framers of the Constitution, second president of the United States, was one of the editors, as was Benjamin Franklin. They were both a bit more cosmopolitan about this than Jefferson was. Jefferson originally wrote, "We hold these truths to be plain and obvious." His editors, Adams and Franklin, said, "Change that." You know why? Because if we present this to Europe, we're trying to get Europe's support, which will be vital if we're going to be battling against Britain, the biggest military power in the world. Particularly, we want France to be on our side. Well, if you say we hold these truths to be plain and obvious, they're just going to say, colonies are always complaining about how the mother country treats them. That is just absolutely not our quarrel. We're staying out of it. But if you put this in terms of the rights of man, a very powerful, important political and moral movement in France at the time, say, we hold these to be self-evident truths that all men, by virtue of their humanity, are entitled to inalienable, it's grammatically wrong, it should be unalienable, but if you will, categorical rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Put it that way, and guess what? Intellectuals in Europe are going to say, this American Revolution is a revolution about the rights of man. It is totally our fight. The idea that a new democracy is going to be fashioned based upon the idea of what we would today call human rights, that is exactly what we wanted. We're in. And indeed, France's support during, I don't know if you were aware of this historical fact, but France's support during the American Revolution was absolutely crucial to our eventually winning independence from England. So, where I'm going to pick up is talking about Kant's influence on human rights and those who labor in the vineyard of universal human rights. Okay.